Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Israel steps up attacks in southern Gaza following collapse of ceasefire. Gaza fighting intensifies as Israel pulls out of hostage talks. Israel bombs hundreds of targets in Gaza as truce efforts continue. White House pressed Israel during bombing pause to change its strategy. China incops into Middle East growth as region veers away from oil. Israel steps up attacks in southern Gaza following collapse of ceasefire. Wall Street Journal. Negotiators are trying to reinstate a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip after Israel's military intensified its attacks on the southern region. The ceasefire collapsed after talks to extend it fell apart. If negotiators fail to reinstate the ceasefire, it will likely lead to the next phase of the war in Gaza. The southern region is expected to be more complex and difficult for the Israeli military to battle than the north. Israel's offensive in Gaza has killed over 15,000 Palestinians, and Hamas' attack on Israel killed over 1,200 people, including civilians. Gaza fighting intensifies as Israel pulls out of hostage talks. Washington Post. For the second day in a row, Israeli warplanes have bombed targets across Gaza, with the heaviest strikes being in southern Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry says at least 193 people have been killed and 652 injured since the collapse of the ceasefire last week. The Israeli Defense Forces reported hitting 400 targets since Friday, suggesting that this second phase of the war will be at least as intense as the first. The Israeli government has indicated that this second phase of the war would continue until Israel had achieved its goal of eradicating Hamas. Israel bombs hundreds of targets in Gaza as truce efforts continue. Al Jazeera. Israel's attacks on Gaza have entered a second day after a 7-day truce with Hamas ended. Talks are continuing between Israel and the Palestinian group to renew a pause in hostilities. The United Nations said the fighting would worsen the extreme humanitarian emergency in Gaza. The report also states that Israel has informed several Arab states that it wants to carve out a buffer zone on the Palestinian side of Gaza's border to prevent future attacks. White House pressed Israel during bombing pause to change its strategy. Washington Post. The Biden administration has urged Israel to limit civilian casualties and protect critical infrastructure in Gaza as it resumed airstrikes on Friday. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the Middle East this week and stated that the U.S. would only back an Israeli military campaign in southern Gaza if Israel took steps to meet these conditions. However, it is unclear whether President Biden would distance himself from Israel if it does not comply. Biden has called for a two-state solution with a revitalized Palestinian Authority running Gaza and the West Bank, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has shown little interest in establishing a Palestinian state. Diplomats believe Netanyahu is unlikely to risk upsetting far-right members of his cabinet whose defection could threaten his political prospects. China incops into Middle East growth as region veers away from oil. South China Morning Post. Chinese startups are increasingly eyeing the Middle East as a potential market for expansion. The region presents an attractive alternative as it seeks to develop tech-driven startup ecosystems and reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Trade between the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, and China has surpassed trade with the US and Euro area combined, and there is an estimated untapped trade potential of $178 billion between China and the Middle East and North Africa, MENA, region. The recent wave of investments in the region has focused on developing products that have the potential to benefit humanity and foster a better, more sustainable way of living through technological advancements. These investments align with the Middle East's commitment to renewable energy and reducing dependence on oil. Chinese companies such as Fourier Intelligence and WeRide have successfully invested in the region and have aligned their business models with the needs of Middle Eastern countries. Turkey's Erdogan, chance for peace in Gaza conflict lost for now. Reuters. President Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey has said that the chance for peace in Gaza after the humanitarian pause was lost due to Israel's uncompromising approach. He emphasized that Turkey is in favor of a permanent ceasefire rather than a humanitarian break and that the exclusion or destruction of Hamas is not a realistic scenario. Erdogan also stated that a contact group formed by the OIC and Arab League would visit the United States to discuss possible resolution of the conflict in Gaza. Kamala Harris stands in for Biden as she makes flying visit to COP28. The Independent. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris announced during her visit to the COP28 summit in Dubai that the U.S. will contribute $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund for developing countries. Harris used her visit to address the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and warned against those who seek to slow or stop progress on climate action. The U.S. also made other announcements at the summit, including plans to build no new coal-fired power plants, domestic rules to cut methane emissions, and a deal with 118 countries to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. At Climate Summit, Turkey, South Africa hit out at Israel over Gaza war. Reuters. World leaders attending the UN Climate Summit have criticized Israel and called for an end to the Gaza war. Some leaders criticized Israel during their speeches at the summit, highlighting the divisions over the conflict and distracting from the discussions on climate change. Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan called the current situation in Gaza a war crime and a crime against humanity that must be ended, while South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa called it a war crime that must be ended now. The war has also been a focus of protests at the summit, with demonstrators calling for a ceasefire. Nowhere to go, say Gazans in south under Israeli bombardment. Yahoo! As fighting in the Gaza Strip continues, those who have fled their homes in the war-torn region are still struggling to find a safe place to seek refuge. The city of Khan Yunis has become the focus of Israeli attacks, therefore those who had escaped the previous fighting in the north have found no solace here, with the population swelling in recent weeks. This has resulted in a lack of proper accommodation and many people are seeking shelter in tents, schools, stairwells and even outside hospitals. A senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that Israel is making efforts to prevent civilian casualties. However, many of the Palestinians are stating that they are not being given adequate places to move to. Kissinger, a war criminal with a Nobel Peace Prize. Al Jazeera. Following the death of Henry Kissinger, former U.S. National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, many media outlets have whitewashed his atrocities, says Sami Ramadani in an opinion piece for Al Jazeera. Kissinger was directly responsible for the deaths of between 3 and 4 million people during his time in office, and his policies paved the way for the U.S. ongoing wars. The bombs over diplomacy approach he championed involved some of the most brutal bombing campaigns in modern history, including carpet bombing Vietnam and Cambodia. The carpet bombing did not stop the communists from taking power, but rather facilitated their victory. Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973, despite having sabotaged peace talks and despite his regret that the U.S. had not used more brutal force to win the war. Kissinger was also responsible for supporting the Pakistani forces that carried out genocide in East Pakistan, the Indonesian invasion of East Timor and the coup in Chile. He also undermined Middle East peace proposals and showed a disregard for Jewish life. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your friendly neighborhood observer from the 6 Degrees world. Today, we have some serious and concerning news coming out of the Gaza Strip. Israel has intensified its attacks in southern Gaza after the collapse of the ceasefire, and negotiators are desperately trying to reinstate it. If they fail, it could lead to the next phase of the war in Gaza. The situation is escalating, with Israeli warplanes bombing targets across Gaza for the second day in a row. The heaviest strikes have been in the southern region, which is expected to be more difficult for the Israeli military to battle than the north. The death toll continues to rise, with over 15,000 Palestinians and over 1,200 people, including civilians, killed so far. The United States is urging Israel to limit civilian casualties and protect critical infrastructure in Gaza. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has made it clear that the U.S. will only back Israel if it takes steps to meet these conditions. However, it remains to be seen whether President Biden will distance himself from Israel if it does not comply. The Biden administration has called for a two-state solution, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has shown little interest in establishing a Palestinian state. In the midst of this conflict, we also have some interesting news from the Middle East. Chinese startups are looking to expand in the region, as it presents an attractive market for their tech-driven products. The Gulf Cooperation Council has surpassed trade with the US and Euro area combined, and there is a huge untapped trade potential between China and the Middle East. This aligns with the Middle East's commitment to renewable energy and reducing dependence on oil. Speaking of the Middle East, President Erdogan of Turkey has stated that the chance for peace in Gaza has been lost due to Israel's uncompromising approach. He emphasized that Turkey is in favor of a permanent ceasefire and that the exclusion or destruction of Hamas is not a realistic scenario. Erdogan also mentioned a contact group formed by the OIC and Arab League that will visit the United States to discuss a possible resolution of the conflict. In other news, Vice President Kamala Harris announced during her visit to the COP28 summit that the U.S. will contribute $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund for developing countries. She also addressed the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and warned against those who seek to slow or stop progress on climate action. World leaders at the UN Climate Summit have criticized Israel and called for an end to the Gaza war. This has caused divisions and distractions from the discussions on climate change. As the fighting in Gaza continues, those who have fled their homes are struggling to find a safe place to seek refuge. The city of Khan Yunis has become the focus of Israeli attacks, leaving many Palestinians with nowhere to go. They are seeking shelter in tents, schools, and even outside hospitals. The lack of proper accommodation is exacerbating an already dire situation. Lastly, I want to touch on the recent passing of Henry Kissinger, a controversial figure in history. Many media outlets have whitewashed his atrocities, despite his direct responsibility for the deaths of millions of people and his role in paving the way for ongoing wars. Kissinger's approach of bombs over diplomacy involved brutal bombing campaigns that facilitated the victory of communist forces in Vietnam and Cambodia. He was also involved in supporting genocidal acts and undermining peace proposals in the Middle East. In conclusion, the situation in Gaza is escalating, and the international community is urging for a ceasefire. It's a complex and tragic situation that requires careful consideration and diplomatic efforts. As always, I welcome your thoughts and questions. What are your thoughts on the conflict in Gaza and the role of international actors in resolving it? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.